Welcome to Kōrero, Kairangahau, which is an informal chat between me and my colleague Rebecca. Today's Kōrero has a special focus on industry partnerships, and we'll be talking about our experiences, our research areas, and our careers more generally. Ko Tom Logan, tōku ingoa.
Ko Rebecca Perez, tōku ingoa.
We're both senior lecturers in the Department of Civil and Natural Resources Engineering. And so Beck, do you want to tell us a little bit about your research and the key problems and issues that you focus on or are interested in?
Yeah, sure. I suppose one thing that brings both Tom and I together is research generally in the field of climate change. So my focus in that area is all about energy and the environment. So I focus really heavily on energy as an infrastructure system, sometimes at the national scale, but sometimes at the city level or the regional scale. And I think a lot about infrastructure transitions and specifically energy transitions. So thinking about how we're decarbonizing our energy system, how we're shifting away from fossil fuels, what kinds of impacts that's going to have on the infrastructure system itself, but also how do we deal with potential future uncertainties as we're thinking about the transitions in that system. And of course, how do we manage the sort of impacts or co-benefits that come along with big infrastructure changes?
Because I feel like that's one of the co-benefits are one of the key things that link our research.
Definitely, yeah.
How did you find yourself in this area?
I did an undergraduate degree in environmental engineering in North America. So I was really focused on water issues and water treatment and water quality and water quantity, which I really liked and have always felt pretty passionately about clean water and sort of water access. And during my undergrad, I was fortunate enough to get some experience as an undergrad researcher and was encouraged to think about future career pathways that were not just the traditional finish your engineering degree, go out and work as a practicing engineer or consultant, but maybe thinking more about getting into research or exploring different areas of engineering that weren't just what I had known during my undergrad. And so I shifted towards research with that, so applied for some PhD programs. And while I was looking for a PhD, I sort of decided that I wanted to go big. So I had done research in the sort of passive co-treatment of wastewater with acid mine drainage, which was really cool. But I was doing these really small scale experiments and that was really fun. But I wanted to save the world. So I had really big ambitions and was just looking for something that would push me in that direction. And that's kind of how I stumbled into the field of energy. And the more you start to learn about it, the more you realize that it is one of the biggest issues, especially when we think about climate change and climate mitigation. It's not only the biggest contributor to our global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's the biggest infrastructure challenge that we will ever face or have yet faced in the world. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think it's funny because my undergrad in natural resources, which I think is equivalent from Canterbury, my one thing I didn't want to do was work in wastewater. And then, of course, found my summer job. I was mapping the cracks in the Bromley wastewater treatment tank, the poo tanks after the earthquake. I was like, how? Why, of all the engineering interns, am I doing this? But yeah, then decided to do a PhD because I felt like in our undergrads we were taught to design a road or do a thing and never really we never investigated why we were doing that or stepping back and thinking about what's the actual problem that we're trying to solve when we do this, and then becoming aware of all of the inadvertent consequences.
Yeah.
And I think that's I feel like we share that with the systems mindset of what are we actually talking about? Let's step back and be what are we actually talking about?
Yeah. How did you find yourself interested in resilience and climate adaptation and risk? coming from doing natural resources here at UC, and then doing the sort of full circle all the way back to being a lecturer here.
Yeah, because as you know, I went to the US on a Fulbright, but I was looking for a research area that was like trying to quantify sustainability or take a more rigorous view. Because like 10 years ago, when I was in that at that stage, I was like, sustainability was still like quite qualitative, which is good. But you know, if you can, you know, the saying about you value things that you can measure.
Yeah.
I ended up going down that path and then came across risk as being a concept for how we can deal with and manage uncertainties. And if you do one thing or not, don't do another. And then I think I became more and more aware of how huge and how unclear, how little we knew about managing risk, and how we're in such a precarious situation. And I just felt like that was and remains like a huge topic without as much leadership as there could be on this. And I feel like there's so much really urgent work that we need to be doing to better understand that. And so, I feel like often that tension between even some of the work that I'm doing with different councils, often we're accused of being too academic. But I'm like, but we're making really important decisions that affect lots of people. And we have to have that scientific rigor.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like your trajectory into dealing with councils and government around risk in the country has been, well, from my perspective, quite impressive. Just like the speed that you've been able to engage at that level. How did you get there?
I feel like I got onto a roller coaster and have just like, it's like a little bit terrifying, and definitely overcommitted, and work way too hard, but I really enjoy it. And I think the why is that I felt like I had to because no one else was doing it. And the how was that I think because I felt that it was important, I was just pushing the conversation. And of course, then we had like Cyclone Gabrielle and the Nelson floods and the Auckland floods and the Westport floods. And it's just like people are crying out for that kind of information and that evidence. And the guidance that we were seeing from different agencies was so poor that I ended up like feeling the obligation to really like say, well, we could be doing better.
Yeah.
Like what about, because obviously you're engaging with different groups as well. How did that, like, what sort of similarities or differences?
Yeah, I think we share a similar desire to see our research go somewhere, which for a lot of us academics means engaging with either industry that are then going to take whatever you're developing and implement it, or government who you can hopefully shape policies or something similar. It could be budget related or whatever you please.
Rather than just have it as a publication.
Publications are part of the job, definitely part of our job, and that's also important, especially from like a science communication perspective. That is definitely how academics.
It's our currency.
Yeah, that is our currency, and like especially internationally, like if you wanted to highlight the good research that you're doing in New Zealand, one of the best ways to do that is through publications or conferences or sort of spreading the word that way.
Don't get acclaim or fame or money from like engaging with people.
No, in a way, I think you don't directly get it, but I think you indirectly get a lot of that.
I think that the engagement that I've had has like strengthened my research and like exposed me to the nuances of the conversation in a way that like no amount of research
Yeah.
like, would be able to do.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to us actually seeking things like funding, what the funders want to see is strong relationships and that the research is going to go somewhere.
Yep.
And the only way for you to do that is to actually have a partnership with industry or government or
I felt like
similar.
early days, I felt like that was really, there was a lot of pressure with that expectation because I felt like we had to develop these partnerships for these grants that then if the grant didn't go through, you were letting down this community and yet you had no resources. And like that always made me really uncomfortable. Like now that I've got some more existing partnerships, it's fine, but like so there's kind of like a
chicken and egg problem.
or like a double-edged sword in a way, like because it loses trust of communities when academics like ghost them because the funding didn't come through.
Yeah, I think relationship building is a skill, and it's not always a skill that we as academics are innately really good at. I think we are really good at doing our research and mostly being introverted, I think. But yeah, I do think it's important, and anyone who shares that desire for their research to have impact, like tangible impact, eventually finds themselves heading towards building relationships with industry or government. And I think that's sort of how I don't want to say found myself, but how I was pushing towards. So like when we think about energy transitions, especially at the national scale or just in general, often that comes from the top down. So that's coming from central government policy strategic directions or even the policy that they're implementing, the budgets that they're implementing, whether or not they're putting bans on new oil and gas exploration, what kinds of strategic geopolitical partners they're focusing on. It's a really big web. And so I knew pretty early on that trying to get myself into that space was the way that I was going to find impact for my research. But at the same time, getting yourself into that space is actually really hard. And it doesn't happen overnight. I think that's the other kind of fallacy that is propagated, that you can just go and talk to someone. And
I think I did a lot of work with different, or at one particular like council, Christchurch City Council. With no funding. Building that relationship, and then from there, it's been fantastic. But it's definitely not you just email someone and put them on the grant and then say you've got a strong relationship.
I mean, sometimes that is
sometimes
what
it
starts.
does. I think that's definitely how it starts. I think, and some people are lucky, but often if the grant fails, you might just have to commit to So I feel like I was careful with grants about what I was promising to.
I think being careful about what you're promising and being conscious of our propensity to spread ourselves really thinly across a lot of things, and maybe thinking carefully about the partnerships and relationships that really matter, which is really hard to do because you're basically saying that some other relationships or partnerships are less meaningful to you.
I think what I did was had one partnership and then applied for lots of different grants that basically more or less meant that if any of them was funded, I could do what I wanted to do. And partially that's because climate risk and resilience and adaptation is all you can tackle it from lots of different sides. And there's so many big research questions that you can write it in different ways. I think that was just good luck rather than good management at the time. But now I'm look back and okay, I would do that again.
I think one thing that helped me in that relationship building was focusing really heavily on trying to build trust. And that's what's enabled us to have a really good relationship. So we've got really strong ties with MB and the teams that are developing specifically the hydrogen strategy, but also the energy strategy. And that has only come through by us being really persistent and open with what we're doing and trying to offer to help where we can and to explain, what our research is, the questions that we have, the models that we're using, how it might be helpful for them. And we're only sort of just recently, in the last year or so, have that relationship becoming stronger and stronger. And like, for better or worse, with the budgetary cuts that are happening with the new government, that trust has enabled particularly the hydrogen strategy team to lean on us researchers way more heavily than they would have in the past, because they no longer have funding to seek out consultants to help them with their modeling work, for example. It's cool to see that they trust us enough to reach out and maintain, or I guess use that relationship. Yeah. Time is useful. I think it's also a big thing when you think about developing those partnerships. You want them to just exist and you want it to be as easy as just reaching out to someone, and then great, you're best friends and you can rely on each other and you call each other up and ask for favors and whatnot. But I think you need time. You need time to prove to people that you know what you're talking about, for them to see the value in your work. And I think the story that a lot of us have in our heads when we come into the academic job is that we can just do everything and we can do it all right now.
I think being academics in New Zealand is such a privilege.
Oh, absolutely.
The opportunities to make a difference, which we'd never have had in the US.
I think if you're motivated, just look at what you can do. Look at what you did in 4 years. I don't think that's achievable in other places. So I will say that having that kind of close link to government and industry is an extremely valuable part of being an academic here.
So I think some of the really valuable things that helped with that was things like resilience to nature's challenges, quite core. Some of the even the knowledge commons and Cure, that having a boundary organization that acted like a point of contact rather than 100 different academic faces and the community. I think that's something that the university needs to improve, is having a good way to manage the relationship. We do it so well with our engagement with Mana Whenua through the Kaiarahi, but we don't do it. We don't manage external relationships from the university, other than more widely. And I think that would be so valuable because then that helps with I was really hesitant to start a relationship with a community based on a student's work, only for them to leave after 3 years. And then I'm well, I don't have the capacity, so what happens? And that's where I think resilience to nature challenges, National Science Challenge, and Quake Core have been so good as vehicles to introduce us to different people and players and
I think also leveraging the decades long connections.
And that's the time that you're talking about, right? And then you can jump into a mature partnership
with a stamp of approval as well, of here's this person who I trust, who I'm bringing in to this relationship because I know they can do X, Y, Z, and that's exactly what you're looking for. I do feel I've had some very fruitful introductions via those pathways.
So I feel that that's almost a peripheral value that's not
highlighted.
And especially with them changing, I think the university needs to think carefully around because the university's vision and values around engagement are something that I am so deeply aligned with. But then how we actually achieve that and how they support that, there's still a lot of systemic or institutional challenges and barriers?
At least for me personally, like thinking about all the other things that come along with an academic job, like you do have responsibilities that create constraints on your calendar. We obviously have a responsibility for delivering quality teaching, and we want to bring those relationships and that research back into the classroom as well. And that has been really good for us, I think, in particular, teaching
And
a
with
course
the,
on climate change. Yeah.
especially with our guest lectures and stuff, because I think that's been a really great way, like the guest lecturers themselves
Yeah.
have been great like connections.
Yeah, exactly. But I do feel like a constant struggle that you feel like as an ambitious early career staff is you almost haven't, um, you spend a lot of time learning and relearning how to balance your workload.
Yep.
And I think it's like careful consideration of your priorities and your values, and trying really hard to stick to your own versions of those
Yep.
and not the ones that other people are indirectly or directly imposing on you with their advice.
That was one of the things I was thinking about, like around one of the things I wish I'd known, which was just like you have to protect your time because no one else is going to protect it for you.
Yeah.
And that's quite different from like coming from a PhD, where at least like for me, I am like really protective of my students' time.
Yeah.
And and any other kind of job where you actually have like a line manager that helps you with workload management, like nah, that doesn't exist, which can be super overwhelming when you're like when lots of people who are in theory who you view as being senior to you are asking you to do things, and then like actually you physically can't do all of that.
Yeah.
I feel like we should have for early careers they should bring the sabbatical forward into like year 2 or 3, just so that
You can figure out the balance.
and just have like a year where you're like, right now I can do all of the things that I've overcommitted to. Like have it like a sabbatical where you stay in New Zealand, stay here, and build those partnerships. Like figure out what your research. Like you've had 2 years to like get kind of like understand the process.
Yeah.
Have a year to get your research like underway to finish off all those things you're like, maybe I shouldn't have said yes to.
But yeah, you absolutely do not get shown or trained or exposed to like probably 80% of what you do on the day to day. But I also think that's kind of a cool part of
It is
being
really cool.
academic
It is really
because every day is something different. Like you can just decide that you're gonna research this topic or I want to become an expert in this area or hey, this is really important and I need to talk to this person. So that is my priority focus for the next year.
What valuable advice have you received?
Oh goodness.
Or what advice would you offer to others?
I don't know. I might steal your advice from before we started filming, to be honest. That is really good advice. Yeah, I think that Tom and I were talking about trusting ourselves, and how valuable that is, especially when you think about your research and partnerships with industry or government, and how much you have to trust that your research is important and is valuable and that you know what you're doing and that the views and science that you've done are worthy of consideration.
I think it goes back to that, like there's a similar setup where we don't have a boss in that sense. Like there's no one protecting our time. There's also no one that's kind of monitoring or evaluating our ideas. So there's no one up the line that can be like, just ignore that. Like if our student gets negative advice or negative review feedback, right, it's like, yeah, it happens. But when we get it, there's no sort of like senior figure that can be like, it's fine. You're just at home sobbing.
Yeah, the little voice in my head really loves that. Yeah, the internal gremlin.
Yeah, and I feel like, I've had to learn to just be like, no, I know what I'm doing, or at least portray that vision, portray that like facade.
Yeah. I don't know. I think actually talking with your similarly leveled colleagues
I
can
think
be one
that's
way
true.
to help. Like you and I often share those kinds of, I don't know, I'm going to call them insecurities because insecurities for me, and sort of talk each other out of our own self doubt or imposter syndrome, which has been really helpful. I think, like, maybe a piece of advice is just recognizing that if you're feeling that way, you are definitely not alone. And probably at least one, most likely most of your colleagues currently feel or have felt that same way. Um, it's not advice, but I think I would be encouraging of anyone else who feels like they want to be in that space, but maybe feels like they can't be for any reason. That just, like, I don't know, there's a lot of false narratives that we tell ourselves about why we can't or why we shouldn't, that are just that. They're totally false. And the reality is that we are experts and we do know what we're talking about. And scientific debate is something that should be happening, and we should be giving advice to government and industry. And so, yeah, I don't know, just a point of encouragement that, like, you can do it. And there are people that you can seek out to give that support if you need it. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the training I did with a science media center and stuff like that was really useful. Just as like another kind of tool on the so that like when you get a phone call from someone in the media, you don't stuff it up like I have done in past. And also just like recognizing that like even like yeah, there's still there's uncertainty and there'll be opposing viewpoints, but like we should still have confidence in putting our like we know we've read about it. We've been working on this for years.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really good. I think another one is probably spending some time, if you can find it, to think carefully about what your priorities are, and how you can make sure that those come through with the work that you're doing, in all aspects of your job. And I'm sure this is true of not in just academia, but I feel like something that really helped me over the last 4 years, I guess, is when I started, it felt so overwhelming, that I just didn't even think about it at all. And I was just trying to do everything and, yeah, working way too much and being a crazy person. But forcing myself to sit down and think about what are the things that I actually value and what are the things that I really want to work on, and what's most important has been really, really helpful.
Yeah, I feel like I did that in the first like my first 6 months. So it was like everything was new and shiny, and I was just trying to get involved in like lots of different things. And then I think the timing for me was good because I started in like September, and then so you've got all the rush, and then everyone goes away in January, and
Yeah.
just like leaves you alone. And that I think was probably when I like wrote on my whiteboard wall, like how do we build resilient communities, and then that's kind of been my like everything I do, and I kind of treated it as like a company vision or mission statement where in theory like everything you do you check back, and that's kind of been like a way that I prioritize and like align with teaching, with service, with which I think I've been like lucky and privileged to be able to like manage that. But yeah, there's being as like intentional about it as well as possible has been as useful.
Yeah. I've got a good segue because if we're talking about advice, then I think something that every new academic, well, certainly for me because I'm non-Kiwi, coming here and being exposed to having to incorporate things like vision Mautauranga into research and teaching was totally foreign to me. Like obviously coming from Canada, we do have Indigenous communities, and that's quite important, but at a totally different level than New Zealand is at. And I found that a hard space to navigate when I was starting out, knowing what to ask or what not to ask and who to go to for help and actually how to do that. And I guess had a huge learning curve that felt really steep at the beginning, but feels a lot better now. But yeah, I don't know if there's like good advice that you have. I mean, you definitely have good experience as well, engaging
Yeah,
with Māori communities and like having those partnerships that have been quite meaningful, I think.
yeah, I'm trying to think what my advice would be, because it's been such a natural link in terms of like when we're talking about risk risk is so spatial that like it really ties in with like Mataranga Hapu, so like the local like really local knowledge. For example, I'm writing a national report for the Climate Commission on exposure from coastal flooding and landslides and how that's changing over time. Like, I'm looking at a range of different assets and elements and what's exposed. There's like no marae exposed to landslides. And we know why that is. Compared, and on the other hand, we've got like a huge number of like critical infrastructure that is, and so I think that that local knowledge, the Mataranga, is has such obvious value, and then equally being able to support and taking a systems perspective, which is so complementary to Te Ao Māori, the like interconnections, to be able to like, because Māori communities are because of the coastal, like the proximity of the coast, like landslides are one thing because they've been there for ages, but throw in climate change, it's like kind of a bit cheating. So obviously now the Māori communities are really exposed. So there's a huge amount of like support where we can enable them to make make informed decisions, and I think I really think the complementarity between systems thinking and Te Ao Māori is just like almost like a no-brainer, but has been really helpful from integrating Vision Mataranga into my research.
Yeah.
And then just like caring.
Yeah.
Like, which sounds dumb, but like I really want to help like the communities figure out the best way of like responding. And often there are so many co-benefits where they can achieve other goals while also reducing their risk.
Yeah, I think you and I share a really big focus on well-being and positive outcomes for communities and society in general, and thinking about those co-benefits and avoiding negative trade-offs. And yeah, I was also similarly pleased with the, I guess, like, yeah, complementarity of what, like, coming in as a systems engineer and feeling a bit insecure about how I might try to fit myself into this research landscape and the sort of, way of New Zealand, I suppose. But yeah, I have found it to be really, really synergistic. And as a non-Kiwi, non-Māori, the support from our Kairangahau Māori at the university in particular has been, for me, like, invaluable. So they've really taught me a lot, and they have put me in touch with a lot of people as well, a lot of communities. So not just our sort of local Ngāi Tuahuriri, but also Ngāi Tahu, obviously, but in touch with communities, for example, up in Northland that are really struggling with energy issues and energy equity, something that I'm really passionate about. So yeah, that's been a big thing for me. So yeah, I don't know. In terms of advice, I guess it's just like taking advantage of the resources that are available,
Yeah.
but also not being afraid to go out and talk to people. I think in general, like people are really receptive to um, our willingness to want to help.
Yep.
And that's something that I found.
Yeah, and I think building the relationship with the kayahi and
Yeah.
explaining your research and knowing that, like talking to multiple kayahi or just because sometimes like one person will just like click and be like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, that has so many opportunities in this space.
Yeah.
And I think it was just like building that up over time and then also showing a commitment to wanting to bring it into your teaching.
Yeah.
I think that like it's kind of it's almost like a sign of good faith. Like looking back, like we did it without like thinking about the benefit to us, but in terms of it shows that you actually like want to do it rather than you're just doing it so you can write your VM statement.
Yeah. But I think the really cool thing for us has been that it's not even a tick boxing exercise. And I don't think it's a tick box exercise for a lot of people. Like when we think about the type of work that we do and like the type of things that we're trying to teach our students, like we're trying to teach our students to see the wider perspective. We're trying to teach them about interconnections and how the infrastructure is connected to itself through the built and the natural domain, but it's also connected to people and it's also connected to, all these other
like the
domains.
and
Yeah, like well-being.
You'd be stupid not to include it.
Yeah, and like that is just an obvious fit.
What would you do if you weren't a researcher?
I think when I was really young, I really wanted to be a doctor.
Yeah,
so I think that would probably be like if I was rewinding all the way to when you choose what you want to do before I decided I wanted to be an engineer. Probably it would be a doctor.
Yeah, I had a doctor phase and a lawyer phase.
Oh, nice.
But I think I would, if I wasn't doing like risk assessment with like if I wasn't doing the kind of consulting and research driven stuff that I do now, I would try and be like Catherine Ryan or Kim Hill, like a really informed journalist who's like answering like the hard hitting questions. And I think it's still about like I was always really impressed by how they could synthesize a lot of really complex information and then hammer people with like hard questions, like insightful questions.
Yeah, I feel like that suits your personality really well.
I think now I'd be like, yeah, I just find them such impressive people.
Yeah.
Being able to like hold like people in power to account with facts and evidence, and that's kind of what I kind of still aspire to do right now as an academic. Yeah. So where do you see your research going next?
That's a good question. I'm really focused at the moment on basically everything to do with energy transitions in the South Pacific. So really focused on New Zealand, but also focused on Pacific Islands, which have their own really special challenges. And yeah, just thinking about the particularities of the infrastructure challenge, but also dealing with uncertainty, which comes around from climate risk and hazards, and then dealing with issues like electrification and meeting our carbon targets and trying to deal with these environmental and social trade-offs as we manage that infrastructure transition here in New Zealand and then in these very different Pacific Island communities. So that's sort of the main drive at the moment, and I would really hope that that's still a driver, but hopefully more informed over the next couple of years. Like, we're sort of really into the modeling work and the scenario exploration and the uncertainty analysis at the moment. And I guess what I'm headed towards, or hopefully headed towards, is thinking about robust decision making. So that's something that's really interesting to me that we've talked a lot about. So that's something that I would like to focus on is how do we how do we think about making non-regret decisions when it comes to those really big questions that are expensive and lock us in for quite a long time, like developing new infrastructure, for example.
Yeah, which is funny because that's basically my answer as well. Like, how do we manage uncertainty and how do we find co-benefits? So it's like the multi-criteria, robust decision-making, whatever approach it is. I feel like for you're like, for those big infrastructure, it's robust decision-making, whereas in communities we've got like adaptive decision-making. But yeah, I think that's where it's really cool that we're working on these two different fields, but our research interests like align so closely, and that's where we can say to communities like this: we can be sustainable and resilient if we get these techniques and this research, like questions answered. Which is like the exciting like collaboration part of the work.
Yeah, I think the coolest thing about us together is like breaking down that commonly thought thing that like
the tension between adaptation and mitigation.
Or sustainability and resilience, and how they are like independent of each other, which is totally
wrong.
False and like so wrong. Like they actually sit on top of each other, within each other, around each other. Completely connected, and like you actually can't separate the two. And I feel like we're pretty good evidence of that. Yeah. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed our kōrero, and we look forward to chatting with you guys again soon.
Kia ora.